Hello again. This video may be about the Zhou Dynasty. However, it is important to note that the Zhou is split into two distinct periods, the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou. Today, we will be going over the first half of the dynasty, the Western Zhou period, spanning from 1045 BC to 771 BC. Also, go watch the Shang video to get some context. Last we left off, King Wu defeated Di Xin and established the Zhou Dynasty, replacing the Shang. However, there was still a lot of resistance in the newly conquered lands, which were loyal to the Shang heir, Wu Geng. So in order to pacify these lands, he would have the Shang heir rule the east as a vassal, so as to not become too unpopular. And to be safe, he also appointed 3 of his brothers to help him rule the east. However, Wu died early in his reign after only 3 years of rule, leaving his son, who was only 13 years old, to rule China. Thankfully, one of his many uncles, Dan, the Duke of Zhou, took over as regent until the young emperor could come of age. However, his brothers, who had been placed by Wu to control the east, thought that Dan was trying to take the crown for himself, and so, joined by Wu Geng with his Shang loyalists and even some outside barbarian tribes, launched a huge rebellion against Dan's regency. At first, the cut-off eastern lands saw most of the fighting because Dan didn't have time to mobilize an army quickly. After about a year of the rebels conquering land uncontested, the Duke of Zhou finally organized his forces and began his counterattack. The fighting was so severe that the old Shang capital of Yin was completely destroyed and ended with Wu Geng dying in battle and the 3 guards being either captured or killed. But the Zhou didn't stop there. They kept marching and conquering external tribes and states that had supported the rebellion. After another year, the war had stopped, and the Zhou had managed to expand. Now that the war had ended, in order to stabilize the nation, the Duke of Zhou introduced the Fengjian system, which was essentially a feudal system of governance in which the king would give land to vassals who would administer these lands and, in return, pay him tax and manpower. Once King Cheng came of age, the duke abdicated and transferred the power to him. Through this system, the Zhou could fund its expansion, which it did under the reign of Cheng as well as his son Kang. Then King Zhao took the throne, and he planned to continue this expansion by invading the state of Chu, which had up until then good relations with the Zhou. He invaded and managed to capture significant parts of the north, but was however unable to occupy them, and was eventually driven out. A few years later, he returned with a thick army to attack again, but was instead killed and defeated at the Han River, with his army being nearly wiped out. As a result, the Zhou army was non-existent for quite some time, which allowed vassal states to declare independence and barbarians to invade. Emperor Mu took power and attempted to stabilize the dynasty through reforms, which worked pretty well. After some time, he invaded the Western barbarians to try and claim some land back. However, he did not manage to fully subjugate them. He then attacked the state of Shu but lost the war and was forced to concede some land. This was the turning point of the Zhou's dominance of China, as it would now be contested by Shu, who would grow into a powerful enemy. Then followed King Gong, who did largely nothing but introduce some economic reforms. Then a couple of kings followed who, say it with me, achieved 0 remarkable things, which gave the enemies of the Zhou breathing room. After them followed a king by the name of Li. He was said to have been a tyrant who raised taxes to satisfy his urges and even passed a law that allowed him to sentence to death anyone who slandered him. He also continued the Zhou tradition of declaring pointless wars against southern states and not beating them. So during his reign, the Huai Confederation, led by Shu, launched a massive counterattack into the Zhou, allied with some Dongyi tribes. They reached as far as the Luo River, threatening to conquer all of the Zhou's eastern lands. But Shu's alliance with the barbarians eventually fell out, and after being defeated in the south, they eventually left. Li had managed to survive one of the greatest threats the dynasty had ever faced. So logically, he kept on being a corrupt tyrant instead of actually doing something more productive. One of his advisors, Duke Zhao Gong, tried to warn him numerous times that this had already happened twice in Chinese history, bearing the same results both times. But Li was having none of that boring history nonsense. so the peasants revolted and exiled him, leaving Duke Zhou and another duke called Zhou Gong to administer the dynasty in a joint regency until an heir was found. Eventually, Li died, and his son Xuan was crowned king. He wanted to re-establish the Zhou as the dominant power in China and began by invading the Western tribes, an invasion which achieved nothing but angering them. And then he attacked towards the south to finally finish off the pesky state of Xu, which had so many times tried to destroy the Zhou. No longer would the people of the south have to suffer being ruled by uncivilized barbarians, as Xuan the Great moved forward, filled with the courage of 1,000 great heroes of Chinese history and marching to the final victory. He lost, and then he died. By now, the Zhou had weakened greatly, not only because of the constant wars in the south, but also because the Fengjian system that was established at the start of the dynasty 300 years ago had allowed vassals to gain greater autonomy, both economically and militarily. Then Xuan's son, King Yu, came to power. After a few years of his rule, a great earthquake hit in the west, and many took this as a sign from the heavens that the dynasty was about to be destroyed. But other than that, his reign was pretty uneventful. One day, King Yu found a concubine which he enjoyed so much that he deposed his queen, which he had married for political reasons, and prince, and made the concubine the new queen of Zhou, and the child he had with her the designated heir. Upon hearing this, the father of the previous queen was understandably quite pissed, and as well as being pissed, he was also in control of the state of Shen, a vassal of the Zhou. So he made an agreement with the barbarians to the west to attack the Zhou capital of Haojing and capture the king, and he also received a helping hand from another state. The attack worked, and Yu, as well as his son, were killed, and the capital was completely destroyed. The states that had backed the rebellion placed King Yu's original son Ping as the new Zhou king, and a new capital was built in the east, to which the Zhou royalty would relocate. This event would mark the end of the Western Zhou period and usher in a new period of decentralization and total vassal autonomy, and the map of China would turn into a complete clusterfuck. This period is known today as the Spring and Autumn period, covering half of the Eastern Zhou, but despite the chaos and instability that it brought, it would be then that the more famous ancient Chinese philosophies and philosophers would flourish. And we will go over those next time.